This is a panel that we were playing around with, it's sort of an experiment. So indulge us a little bit and participate in our experiment. And the experiment is that if we all believe that when Bush leaves office, there's a chance to reframe, rethink, reorient large arguments that have been made by our government about the challenges that we face, there's probably no area that needs greater rethinking or reorientation than the way that we look at America's role in the world, our foreign policy, our security policy. And what we wanted to do today was start to think about what a progressive foreign policy approach would be, not starting from where we are, but from where we want to be at this moment in time, this important moment in time. And so we call this panel an age of possibility. And what we want to experiment with is that there's so many ways to look at foreign policy, America's role in the world, security policy, and we wanted to start from a place that wasn't fear-based, using security language, and that is about threats, but about opportunities and the idea that we're at a moment of great possibility in the world, and that America's role in that age of possibility is exciting, and that we really are facing, within a potential Obama presidency, a moment where we can imagine a global alliance for progress in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. And so that's the premise of this discussion. And so I want to thank you for being here. And joining me are two remarkably smart and wonderful people. Andrei Cherny to my left, who, the bios are all in the books, obviously, but Andrei is, really been one of the true intellectual leaders of the modern sort of center-left politics. I got to know Andrei when he was still an undergraduate in college, and he wrote a book at a very young age. He was the editor of a magazine at a very young age. He helped write the Democratic Platform when he was in his mid-20s. I mean, we used to describe him as the most accomplished under 30 thought leader in America. He's now a little bit older than that, but Andrei has just written his second book, right, called Candy Bombers, and he's going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, and I strongly recommend it. But Andrei has really been, I think, one of the most thoughtful thinkers and writers in left of center politics, and currently, among his many things that he does, edits a wonderful intellectual journal called Democracy, a journal of ideas, which I strongly recommend and which I'm happy to be a supporter of. Also joining us today will be Michael Moynihan, who is the director of the Green Project at NDN, the organization that I work for. Michael has also had many years, also a published author, had many years of service in the government. He's currently just finishing up a PhD at Princeton. He's been teaching at NYU and has joined NDN within the last year to head up our new and wonderful and spirited Green Project. And he's going to be talking about how climate change and some of the things that Al Gore talked about this morning fits into this whole new emerging narrative. So let me just offer two thoughts, and I'll turn it off to our my two peers. What brought us to this discussion was there are two things that I've read recently that have been very inspiring to me and helping me understand the moment that we're in. First is Fareed Zakaria's new book called The Post-American World, which I strongly recommend. And he uses a term in the book where he talks about how we are in a moment that he describes as the rise of the rest, meaning that what's happening in the world today is that if America was the global hegemon, the dominant power in the world, that we're now seeing the rising up of the rest of the world, and that the gap between America and other nations is lessening, and that we are seeing a very different and more distributed, and frankly more equal, if you want to call it that way, arrangement of the nations of the world in a way that we haven't seen speak up a little bit, in a very long time. Let me speak a little closer. It's a big and powerful idea. It also, I think, speaks to the moment that we're in. And if any of you have been traveling at all, globally in recent years, it is remarkable how much you can go to, any city in virtually any emerging country and how much it feels like a Western city. And with, obviously there are differences, but with technology and media and modern skyscrapers and global brands, I mean, we really are, the world really is coming together as never before. And it's something that I think is a new and exciting opportunity, because it means that it's not just America and certain Western European nations that will be leading this alliance for progress. There are now countries in all parts of the world that can participate. They have resources. They've got, they are successful states, not emerging or failed states. There are many more nations now who are capable of participating in solving the great challenges that are ahead of us. The second thing that I read just recently that has been inspirational to me is a big Brzezinski's book called The Second Chance, which I also strongly recommend, where he talks about, in very much the way that Zakaria does, he talks about the rise of the rest in a different way, though, not about nation states and organized governments, but about the awakening of the world's people. And that just like what Al Gore discussed this morning about how we're seeing in this country, right, this rise up of average everyday people to make their country a better place, and that's really what, to me, what the Netroots has been about at its best, has been this incredible ability now for everyday people to engage in the life of their country. We're going to see a similar thing happen globally, right? I mean, that, that with now these tools that all of you have at your disposal that we're pioneering here in the U.S., with the middle class exploding around the world, with rising standards of living, with time of relative peace where we don't have the same kind of global threats that we faced in the 20th century, is that you're seeing now, billions and billions of people who are able to participate in this discussion about our common future, who are wired together as never before. I mean, half the world's people have access to a cell phone today. It's really a remarkable thing. And that we really are, I think, seeing an opportunity where not only will be nation states that will be working in this global alliance for progress, but we will be able to tap into the creativity, the passion of everyday people as never before. And Brzezinski in this book challenges America to recognize that if we don't get on the right side of this global awakening of everyday people around the world in these formerly develop, these nations that are developing and formerly failed states, that we will really truly be on the wrong side of history and what's emerging in the 21st century. And that, so the premise of this discussion is to really look at the next 10 to 20 years in a completely different way, perhaps, than America's been looking at it. We have great challenges, we have enormous threats, but we also have great opportunities and great. And this really is, to me and to those of us here, a great moment of possibility. So that's the setting for this. We're now going to hear from our two panelists, and then open up, obviously, have a conversation with all of you. Andrei, welcome.
Thank you. And I think that's a great way to set up this conversation. I just want to say a few words about Simon and NDN, because NDN really has been my political home since it started 12 years ago now, this summer. And remember running into Simon at the Chicago convention a few lifetimes ago, and him talking about this new organization he was going to start. And it's been my political home not just because it's one of the few places that would take me, but because it really has been the place that most represents the kind of politics that I believe in, and that is the reason that I'm here today, and the reason I think so many of us are here today. That kind of forward-looking, exciting, creative vision of what American politics should be, and what the Democratic Party should be. And I say this literally all the time, whoever I'm talking to, that if you really want to know what's going to be going on in American politics in a few years, and what's going to be conventional wisdom a few years after that, look at what NDN is talking about today. Because whether it was the rise of Silicon Valley and its importance, whether it was the rise of Latinos as a voting power, whether it was the rise of the Netroots and all of that represented, whether it was the new progressive infrastructure, I can go down the list. All of the things that everybody talks about today are the things that Simon and NDN were talking about years before anybody else. So I am honored to be here today with him. It goes without saying. I'm wearing two hats. My main hat here is as editor of Democracy, a journal of ideas, which, if it were not for the wonderful people at FedEx, we would have a bunch of copies for everybody here today. But if you come back on Monday, we will have copies for everybody. Luckily, though, this is Netroots Nation, so you can go to democracyjournal.org and get everything there, and you won't have to read it in the Dead Tree edition. But that's my first hat. My second hat is as the author of Candy Bombers, the book that Simon mentioned. Thank you, Vanna. But let me kind of weave those two things together, and I'll start out talking about the book. The book really begins, opening pages are really 60 years ago this summer, June 1948, and it takes place on the night that Thomas Dewey is being nominated as the next president of the United States at the Republican Convention in Philadelphia. And Harry Truman is watching the convention on television, first time a convention is broadcast, this new media environment of the time and this transformational moment. And it's a moment in America when things are really coming at loose ends for this country, and especially in its foreign policy. It's 3 years after the end of World War II, and by every measure, the occupation of Germany is failing. The country is becoming more anti-democratic as each month goes by, becoming more and more pro-Nazi as each month goes by. The security situation, the economic situation is getting worse and worse. And there is a sense that this huge experiment is about to come falling apart. In Berlin, the capital city, 3/4 of the housing is uninhabitable. Packs of wolves are roaming through the streets. People have been living at lower than starvation levels for about 4 years at that point. And just as that occupation is at a low end, so is the American foreign policy of the post-war world at a low end. Again, 3 years after the end of World War II, and America is really back on its heels. All through the previous year before that summer of 1948, the countries of Eastern Europe that were democracies at that point start falling one by one to what seems to be very clearly an advancing Soviet threat. Poland and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, each of them start falling to Soviet power, and those democracies are extinguished. And at that point, everybody knows that the next place the Soviets are going to move is Berlin, this island of democracy, the western part of it, an island of democracy, 2.5 million people in one of the largest cities in the world at that point, living surrounded by Soviets for 90 miles in every direction. America's role in the world is being denigrated. The faith of the world is standing at, America's lost the faith of people around the world. You have the Marshall Plan announced a year earlier, and yet after almost a year, Congress has not taken action on it. It's still sitting in committee. Nobody wants to embrace it. Both the right and the left of American politics are strongly opposed to the Marshall Plan. You have America's military basically having been almost completely disbanded after World War II. And there was a sense that not only is the Soviet threat going to be going to Berlin, but really Germany was after that. France and Italy are really seen as on the verge of a communist takeover. And of course, Harry Truman's political standing in that June of 1948 is also at a low point. As I said, Thomas Dewey is being nominated. The Democratic Party is fractured. You have Henry Wallace running as really the representative of the heart and soul of the Democratic Party, the person who had been Franklin Roosevelt's vice president, and was seen by most activist Democrats as the person who should have taken Roosevelt's place as the inheritor of the Roosevelt revolution in American politics, was then fired by Truman from Truman's cabinet, sets out in 1947 on this huge campaign around the country, getting hundreds of thousands of people to come see him in these enormous stadium rallies, something we have not seen in American politics any time before that point, and probably something that wasn't equaled until maybe Dean in 2003 or Obama in 2007, and kind of the excitement about a candidate in a pre-presidential election year. And so with these two of Franklin Roosevelt's vice presidents running against one another, the Democratic Party is split in a very fundamental way. And on that night in June of 1948, June 24th, is when the Soviets put a blockade around the western part of Berlin, cutting off all of the food and supplies that those 2.5 million people were relying on a daily basis in order to keep themselves from completely starving. Every piece of food really that people were eating there, every piece of coal that they were using to heat their homes, to power their industries and factories, their workplaces, all of the medicine, clothing, everything really that those 2.5 million people counted on was suddenly cut off from the world. And Truman really had three options at that point. The first is the one that just about every single one of his foreign policy advisors said was really our only option, and that was to abandon West Berlin. George Marshall, George Kennan in the State Department at that time, people like Omar Bradley in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all these people saying that really America had no choice but to leave West Berlin, to turn over those 2.5 million people to the Soviets. We were outnumbered 62-1 militarily in that area. And these are the people who won World War II, who knew something about the calculus of power and military strength, and they said there's simply no way we can risk being completely overrun by a Soviet invasion. We need to pull back to the western part of Germany and turn over Berlin. You had the general on the ground in Germany, the head of American forces in Europe, General Lucius Clay. His solution was to send an armed convoy, break through the blockade, fire our way past the Soviets, which at that point was pretty clearly would have caused World War III. And the last option was basically just to sit back and do nothing, do what Omar Bradley said was stand on quicksand and watch as the people of West Berlin just starve before our eyes and the eyes of the world, and eventually would probably rise up against us and kick us out of there. And in the midst of this, really as an afterthought, was what started the Berlin airlift. It was just a couple of planes, really the only planes we had at our disposal of the kind of bigger planes, C-54s, that were the defining plane of the Berlin airlift. We had two such planes in all of Europe at the time. There was one daily flight going from Germany, Western Germany, to West Berlin. And so in the midst of this, they said, let's try to augment the rations that we do have, the 20 days of stockpiles that are in West Berlin, augment them even by a few hours as we try to mull over this decision and figure out what we can do diplomatically. And so we did that for a day or so, did that for a few more days, brought more planes, and really against the better judgment of all of the wise men, of all of the great thinkers of American foreign policy and military strength, Truman made the decision to put all the resources we had into this aerial lifeline, even though it put America's military strength in grave threat because it could have easily been destroyed by the Soviets in an invasion. That is really kind of the background to this whole story, but you know, where it fits into what we're talking about today most clearly is in a number of ways, and the first and foremost is that that moment was really a moment of enormous improvisation, one where we were living in a completely different moment in American history, the first time that we had ever been at the summit of world power, not just in a time of war, but in a time of the threat of war, when we looked around and there were no other great competing powers in the free world. Britain and France and all these other powers had been decimated by the war, and we were standing alone. And so at that summit, we had to, as a country, figure out how we were going to act. What is America's way of acting in the world? What is our special way of acting in the world as a country that is different, perhaps, than the kind of traditional power and traditional way of thinking about things that we saw from the past great powers in the world? And we had this improvisation in the Berlin airlift, but we had it in a whole host of other areas as well. And this was the same period where you had the creation, really because of the Berlin crisis, of NATO. Because of the Berlin crisis, the Marshall Plan came into effect not as just an idea, but as something that was real. You had the United Nations a couple of years before that. You had the IMF and World Bank and GATT, and all of these kind of great organizations that defined the post-war world coming into being at this point when America was really, in many ways, leading the world in figuring out what is the architecture of the world going to look like. And this is where it comes into play with democracy and what we do at that journal, which is we try to take a step back in terms of thinking about what the world should look like and what progressives should be doing, not in the short term, but in the long term. What kind of thinking should we be putting forward that is not just grounded in our politics, but grounded in our beliefs, grounded in actually tackling some of the big challenges we face today. And that's why I think what Simon said in introducing this conversation is so important, because we really are at a moment that is crying out for some real fundamental rethinking of our foreign policy. Yes, we need to figure things out in Iraq and deal with that tragedy for America and what it's all meant. Yes, we need to clean up the mess of the Bush administration. But if we do all that and do all that successfully, we will have failed, because we really are in a much bigger moment right now than all of those kinds of challenges. It is not just about cleaning up the mess of the past few years. It is really about thinking in an original way about the kind of world we want to be building right now. Because we are dealing with a set of threats that are not just the next generation of the kinds of threats we faced before, whether it was communism or fascism, but some very different kinds of threats. We are dealing with a set of threats that, as many people have talked about, know no boundaries, whether it is global terrorism or global warming or global poverty or global disease. These are kinds of threats that aren't really going to be associated with a nation state. And our thinking of foreign policy throughout American history, and really, since 1688, when you had the Treaty of Westphalia, has been really the idea that the great challenges of the world are coming from other nation states. And that's no longer true at this moment. We are in a moment where it's not going to be, at least for the foreseeable future, some other great nation state that's going to be confronting us. It's going to be these kinds of threats that all nation states and all countries around the world are going to be facing. And at the same time we're dealing with that, we're also dealing with a world where, for the first time, you have most people in the world living in democracies. And so you have to speak not just to a king or a dictator or somebody else, but you actually have to, on a regular basis, be able to speak directly to people around the world, because they are the ones who are pulling the strings of those countries, and you have to be able to convince them, and not just function at the level of ambassadors talking to one another at embassies, but speak directly to people. And you have to do that not just for the reason of the fact that most people are living in democracies right now, but the fact that the solutions to the kinds of challenges we face are going to be ones where governments are going to play an enormous role, but they're not going to play the only role, and that a lot of it's going to be solved from a bottom-up level. If we're going to really tackle climate change, yes, we are going to have the kinds of things that Al Gore was talking about this morning happen at the level of governments. We are going to have the successor to Kyoto that's going to come along and really have countries deal with their economy in a very different way, but we're also going to have to be able to convince people to act in different ways in other countries, just as we're trying to convince people to conserve and recycle and do all these things in our own countries. The solution to climate change is going to happen in these big international conferences, but it's also going to happen when you convince a factory owner in China to change his light bulbs. The solution to the kind of great pandemic diseases that are threatening so much of the world is going to be when you convince people in the world to practice better hygiene or to practice safe sex. And that's not going to be something that happens from the governmental level. And the last thing is what Simon said as well, which is that we are dealing not just with a set of threats, but really a set of opportunities. That this moment of globalization, broadly spoken, not just in terms of the economy, but everything else, is one that we can really use as a way to tackle and to be able to have an opportunity to reshape the world in a much more progressive way, to be able to reach into the lives of people in countries who, when all this was happening in 1948, were ignored. People in the dark places of the world, Africa and Asia and all these places that were so long ignored. We have the power now, as America leading a free world and leading a set of people around the world and leading forces of democracy and freedom, to be able to have an impact on the lives of people that will not only be able to change their lives for the better, but also inspire them to believe in the values that we believe in as America, and inspire them to believe in America as a force for good. And I think I'll just leave on that note, because, out of the Berlin airlift in that moment, we were able to create a world where we did not go into World War III, a world where you did not have the Soviets being able to occupy all of Europe and Asia as looked very possible in these months, but you're also able to turn around the people of Germany who went from hating America to loving America, and you're able to inspire people around the world. You know, the biggest protest in solidarity with America after 9/11 was in Berlin. And there's a reason that Barack Obama is speaking in Berlin on Thursday, where he is going to, I think there's a good chance he'll talk a lot about this 60th anniversary of the Berlin airlift and what it meant. And there's a reason for that, because even in Berlin today, 60 years later, after generations have passed, they look at America in ways that are very different from any place else in the world. I'll leave, no, I'm going a little long, I'll just leave with one story, which is about 2 months ago, there was something that happened in Berlin for the first time in its history. And that was a citizen referendum was put on the ballot. They had the power to do so, kind of like we have initiatives here, but it had never been done before, that you had people in Berlin gathering signatures to put a question on the ballot, and the question was about opposing the decision of the government of the city of Berlin to shut down Tempelhof Air Base, which was the American air base during the Berlin airlift. And 200,000 Berliners signed a petition to put that on the ballot to stop the city government from doing so. And it was only an advisory referendum, so there was rather low turnout, but of the people who showed up, 60% of Berliners voted to keep the airport open. Now think to yourself, any place else in the world that you would have a noisy, polluting, private jet airport located smack in the middle of the city. Imagine an airport basically right here on Congress Street in Austin or in your home city that loses $15 million a year and have the people in that surrounding area voted to keep it open rather than close it down. And the sole reason they did was because of the people of Berlin's memories, people who are alive then, people who weren't alive then, about America and what it represented to them. And think to yourself, are we doing the things in the world today, defensively, proactively, in terms of seizing opportunities in places like Baghdad and Kabul and everywhere else in the world that are going to engender that same kind of faith in America and what it represents 60 years from now?
Thank you. And Michael.
Okay, well, thank you. Is that working?
Yeah.
Okay. I think we are living in a new era of possibility, and I want to talk a little bit about how I see that era and what its key components are. In many ways, this new era really began with the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, I guess you could say, at the end of the 1980s. And clearly the 1990s and the period leading up to September 11th was a period of what appeared to be great possibility. And then with September 11th, kind of everything went on hold, and all the sort of optimism and progress that had come out of the fall of the Soviet Union and what some were already calling the unipolar moment suddenly really disappeared. And we entered this this period, which I would say more than anything else was characterized by fear. Now, it's understandable that America was fearful after September 11th, but really the beginning of fear is the end of freedom, and the end of fear is the beginning of freedom. And I think what happened with the response to September 11th was that the entire country essentially became somewhat traumatized, and I think, quite frankly, that the administration did not do anything to discourage that, and arguably contributed to this climate. Many of you probably flew in here, as I did, and one thing I noticed as I was entering the airport was sort of in the background, the loudspeaker was saying, "The threat level today is orange." I don't know if any of you heard that, but it's kind of reached the point now where those sort of pronouncements that go on in the background are almost like background noise. You don't really pay so much attention to them anymore. And we've just come through, and we're actually sort of still in the midst of what's been an incredibly wonderful, in some ways, and cathartic experience for our country, which is the reassertion of democracy in this political campaign. So at the same time that you can say, well, it would have been nice if the Democrats had picked their candidate a little bit earlier in the session, this incredible exercise of democracy, I think, has helped to kind of lift us out of that fearful atmosphere that we were really in for a number of years after September 11th. And we are now clearly, as we approach a new administration, entering a new era, which is, I think, going to be one of great possibility. So what are some of the things that we can look forward to if we begin to think of our engagement with the rest of the world in a hopeful, positive way, as opposed to kind of a fearful way? Because if you think about it, the Bush years were years of kind of initially almost a giddy fascination with America's sort of power as the single, I guess, superpower, but yet at home this kind of like this fearful nature towards the rest of the world. This idea that we weren't even going to engage with old, quote-unquote old Europe, and that essentially we were alone out there with perhaps a small coalition of the willing, and that the world was something hostile that was not part of not an arena for creating good things, but rather something that we had to fear. I think we've moved past that point, and as much as we still have to deal with the Iraq situation, Afghanistan, and the other many trouble spots around the world, we also, I believe, will have an opportunity to kind of reestablish America's reputation and also America's role in the world. And clearly, Obama's trip next week is going to be part of that. I mean, there's every indication that that he's going to be kind of greeted by immense crowds, and that this is viewed in many ways as kind of a homecoming of America back to its role as kind of an international leader. Let me shift from that to talking a little bit about the issues that I'm working on at NDN, which are primarily green issues. And as Al Gore mentioned today, this global challenge of climate change is something that inherently brings everybody together. It's one where global leadership is required and where the U.S. is really uniquely qualified to lead a process that will actually address this problem. And it's, again, something that as part of our disengagement in recent years, we've stepped back from, and we now have to step forward to meet fully. This is an issue where, first of all, on a very practical level, the U.S. has to come up with a policy prescription on how we are going to address greenhouse gas emissions. But secondly, it's one where just think of the ability of if, for example, the people of China, which is now the largest greenhouse gas emitter, even larger than the United States, were to begin to organize, because they are the ones who are breathing, the what's coming out of Chinese smokestacks every day. If they were to work together and sort of at a grassroots level change their country's policy, what that could do. Al Gore is trying to really create a grassroots movement here in the U.S. to get the American people to similarly put pressure and organize and get activated to put pressure on our government to do something. But imagine if a global coalition from the grassroots could come together and basically exercise its power that it now has under this new technology, what we could accomplish. So this is very much a time, I think, when the technology is creating new opportunity and possibility, when the end of the Bush administration and hopefully the beginning of a new Democratic administration will create a different outlook towards the rest of the world, and where the U.S. is poised to once again, really lead. And I think Obama is very well suited to do that, assuming that he becomes the next president. So there are any number of issues that, when you think about them, are just, if you kind of have a glass full attitude as opposed to a glass half full attitude as opposed to a glass half empty attitude, where U.S. leadership could make a tremendous difference. Climate change is clearly one of them. Raising people out of poverty, which is another issue that NDN has been engaged in, is something where U.S. leadership could make a huge difference. Addressing the various security challenges in a hopeful way as opposed to a kind of fearful way is something where we could begin to, as Simon said at the outset, kind of build an alliance for progress that could really transform the way the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world. So granted, at any moment there could be a crisis that could kind of put people back in that fearful mood, But at the moment, I think there is a tremendous opportunity to start doing positive things that bring people together to solve challenges, as opposed to separating us from one another, which inevitably protracts and makes meeting these challenges more difficult.
Michael, thank you. Just one last thought, and yeah, clapping is okay. Just one last thought, and we'll open it up for questions and comments, is that, and again, this is a thought experiment a little bit. We're not here with concrete policy recommendations, but it was interesting listening. Just one quick thought is that when Andrei was talking about sort of the march of the Soviets and of communism and how much then that spurned us to action with NATO and with all the other things that you listed that were done back in the late 40s, we're not starting. I mean, this is the most important thing I just want to say, is that we're not starting from a position now where we're under threat as a nation in the way that we were at that moment. That our values, there isn't this looming giant called the Soviet Union, which was creeping across Europe, that had been so instrumental, much more so than America had been, in defeating Nazi Germany during World War II. That we are facing if you use the threat language, the threats that we're facing today, perhaps the exception of climate change, right, are not anywhere near on the scale of the major threats that we faced in the early part of the 20th century. And I think, so what it means from a conceptual standpoint is that if you use a football analogy, right, I mean, we're starting on the 40-yard line, we're not starting on the 10-yard line or the 20-yard line. And it means that if we're going to go forward, it means it can be more towards the idea of actually bringing nations together to solve things like global poverty and climate change, and how do we deal with migration and immigration, how do we restore broad-based prosperity in an age of globalization where it's much harder to do. Whatever your list of challenges are, pandemics, I mean, all the things that Andrei talked about, I think we have to get out of the mindset that we are under siege, and that the world is, as Michael pointed out, is that the Bush philosophy was that we had no allies, we only had adversaries, that the world was a dark and dangerous place. The world is not a dark and dangerous place. It isn't, particularly if you've traveled in it at all recently, right? I mean, the world is lifting itself up. It is, you go to these countries. I mean, I spoke at the World Economic Forum of Latin America a few months ago in Cancun, and what was staggering to me to be there was just how relentlessly optimistic everyone, there was a panel of 8 heads of state at one point, and how relentlessly optimistic this entire event was for 2 to 3 days. You come back to the United States, and it was such a different tone in the discussion that we're having here. Is that, and I think that the rest of the world sees themselves as lifting themselves up, as making tremendous progress, as building a middle class, of actually improving their democracies. Right? We're living in a moment of extraordinary progress around the world, and we don't feel that here at home. And we don't feel, our leadership didn't understand, I think, in these last few years, how much the rest of the world was moving in a direction that we should be proud of, because in essence they were following the American playbook to move ahead as they were. And so I think when we wake up from the slumber of the Bush years, when we look around the rest of the world, it's going to be a world that is looking to us as their inspiration, and has been, as Andrei was saying, and is ready to get to work with the old America to sort of now not just litigate, because we're going to, Malachi's statement in the last, Malachi's endorsement of Obama's plan, right, was kind of one of the most remarkable moments of this entire Bush administration, the last 24 hours, is that Malachi himself gave a global public repudiation of George Bush and the entire neocon experiment on the eve of Barack's trip to Iraq. And what it means is that we are increasingly, with the negotiations with Nick Burns and going to sit down with Iranians, if you go down the list of all the things, the EPA releasing, data this week showing that climate change is real, hard to believe, right? I mean, you go through this, we are seeing the rollback of, and now I think the routing of the neocons in the administration, which was really the great source of disappointment here in the United States. And I think the world that we're going to wake up to, and starting with the 2 weeks of the Beijing Olympics, starting in just a month, is that we're going to see this ultra-modern, highly sophisticated civilization, right, standing itself up again in China, probably the greatest civilization that humankind has ever seen, the Chinese. But we're also going to see the challenges. We're going to see the athletes being suffered with the pollution there. That the American women's soccer team played the World Cup last year in China, and they had to practice outside of China because the pollution was so bad that it was affecting their ability to run and practice on a playing field, right, in actual mainland China. We're going to see in all of its glory and all of its modernity, we're also going to see all the challenges, I think, of what it takes to get ahead in this 21st century, which is why the work that Michael's doing and everyone else who's involved in this climate change discussion is going to be front and center of our foreign policy debate in the next administration going forward. So those are some thoughts. Happy to hear from you. We appreciate the opportunity just to kick some stuff around here. I mean, this probably is not as rigorous as some of the other panels you've been to, but we want to say that this is an exciting time. We're glad to be here. Nathaniel, you want to jump in? I'm going to say one brief thing and turn it to my colleagues, which is I think this balance between opportunity and threat is that we have to get a better balance. I mean, part of the message of this panel is that we've been out of balance here in the U.S. the last 7 years, and that they're on the climate change. I mean, listening to Gore this morning, right, and Michael has been writing. So what I was very glad about is that everything Al Gore said today was very similar to what Michael's been saying. I was very proud of Michael because he's really been, I think, becoming a major thought leader in this whole climate change debate. And his blog is amazing. It's on our blog. Is that Gore spoke in very much terms of opportunity. I mean, if you listened to his language, it was, we can do this, not that we are, he, of course, evoked the polar ice cap melting and all sorts of bad, crazy stuff happening, right? But at the same time, the message was, we can do this, we can solve this, we can get it done. And I think that basic mix of making sure that we put it into proper proportion, that we understand and not exaggerate threats, that we actually have an accurate understanding, Nate, of the challenges that face us, and also come up with the commensurate levels of response that are needed to tackle them has been so missing from the discussion in the United States. And I think that's the opportunity we have, is not to be Pollyannish about the challenges we face, but to also not be overwhelmed by them, to ignore them either, and to use the very much can-do kind of American sentiment, right? This entrepreneurial, innovative, creative, imaginative kind of way that Andrei was describing earlier. We need that now more than we've needed in a long time. The level of creativity and imagination to deal with what you're talking about is not something we understand how to do now, but certainly this is what we must do, right, as people over the next 10 to 20 years. And I think having belief that it can get done is going to be key for us succeeding.
I would just say that even when you have an imminent threat, and there are certainly many examples of that, from FDR during World War II to the Depression to Winston Churchill during the bombing of Britain, the proper thing for a leader to do is to be optimistic and to talk about solutions and sort of get people going in a positive way. Yes, there's a real threat, but we're going to meet that threat. What was a real failure of leadership, I think, in this last administration was that rather than sort of be optimistic about how we're going to deal with it, they almost tried to scare us even more. So I think with respect to climate change, it is a serious threat, but we have to focus on solutions. And actually, it's a tremendous opportunity at the same time that it's a challenge.
Yeah, I'll agree with what both of them just said. I have my own personal history with this. I was 21 when I started as Al Gore's Vice President Al Gore's senior speechwriter. This is the mid-'90s, and what everybody now knows as Inconvenient Truth was not even PowerPoint. I don't think we had PowerPoint back there. We had actual slides, a slide projector, that he would literally go around the country over and over again, giving that presentation. Some of it verbatim for what became Inconvenient Truth almost 10 years later. And it was a presentation that was over and over again ignored. And every single smart person in the Democratic Party would troop into the White House and tell him he was insane for doing this. It was going to cost him the presidency. It was going to hurt Democrats. We were going to lose Michigan. We were going to lose West Virginia. We were going to do all these things. And that he needed to stop talking about this issue that nobody cares about, this kind of esoteric, wonky, scientific issue that is not a bread and butter concern. He should be out there talking about jobs and healthcare and things like that. And he kept on doing it, which is, I think, a lesson to all of us, hopefully, about what political leadership really is. But we talked a lot back then about how do you motivate large-scale action without an imminent threat. How in the American political system can you do that? And we clearly did not figure out how to do it back then and are still struggling with how to do it now. I think that Simon is right that it is a balance because this is a real threat, and we have to see it as a threat. At the same time, whenever, as Michael was saying, whenever you have a threat, you always have an opportunity. I mean, you think back to how Tony Blair talked about 9/11 right after it happened, and about how the kaleidoscope of the world had suddenly shifted and all the pieces were in motion, and before it sets a gun, we have a chance to reshape the world fundamentally. And that's very different from, as Michael was saying, the way that Bush talked about it, which is, holy you-know-what, they're out to get us. I think our challenge here is to be able to do both, to be able to convey to people the magnitude of the threat, at the same time not give people the sense that things are so beyond the pale and that the problem is of such great scale that we can't do anything about it, and so scare people that it inhibits action. We need to actually be able to tell people about the threat in a way that inspires action. For each of us in our personal lives, I'm sure when there is an immediate threat, you react a lot quicker than for an immediate opportunity. All of us in our lives have let opportunities pass us by, but when there's a threat, it inspires you much more clearly to action. But the challenge here is how do you take that threat and make it into one that is manageable and that is one that can actually drive us towards a solution and not just wringing our hands. I think it's going to be a challenge. I think, you listen to what Al Gore said today about the 10-year goal and why he doesn't want to go work in an Obama administration, and he said because his challenge is to create a political space that politicians can work in. And that's a very realistic kind of way of looking at the world. I think all of our role here, whether it's Netroots, all of us who care about these issues, our role at Democracy, I think the role at NDN, is to keep on pushing the boundaries of that discussion. Because when you look at everything that's on the table in American politics today, it is puny compared to the scope of the kind of change that Harry Truman and the others did right after World War II in that moment of enormous flux, and it's puny compared to the kinds of challenges, threats, opportunities we face today. When we're talking about which countries do we add on to NATO, an alliance created to meet a Soviet threat that is no longer there, when you talk about how do we respond to different kinds of currency crises through the IMF and World Bank, which were created to deal with an economy in the world that was very different than we are looking at today, it is tinkering at the edges when we need to have a fundamental rethinking. What Simon was talking about of an alliance for progress around the world, whether that is something that actually comes into being as an actual alliance or however you want to think about it, that kind of scale of change is what we need. And it is going to be, I think, imperative on all of us to be able to keep on pushing the boundaries of debate in this country. That has been the role of what the right wing did and what conservatives did throughout the 1970s and 60s and even during the Reagan years in the 1980s to keep on pushing things. And the things that they first talked about, whether it was the neoconservative foreign policy or Social Security privatization or supply-side economics, so on and so forth, down the line, all of which were dismissed as crazy, outlandish schemes that would never be taken seriously when they were first proposed, came into the American political debate. Now, our challenge is to come up with better solutions than all of those things, but to think in similarly broad, ambitious, creative ways, and not just be going for what's going to pass Congress in this next legislative session, but what are the things we can start talking about today in 2008 that in 2020 will be very much in the American political dialogue.
Yeah, I would just say that Obama, two things. Obama, just by virtue of the enthusiasm and the kind of, he's almost, what he's done so far is almost beyond traditional politics. And I think just seeing that phenomenon is going to encourage, for example, politicians in Europe to think, maybe there's something that I've missed here, just sort of like dealing with, small issues. Secondly, I agree that the scale of change that we've seen so far, even the scale of proposal, is very modest compared to the changes that have occurred in the opposite direction during the conservative revolution. And there's an awfully long way to go just to get back to where we were.
Quick thought on just the role of government. It's a great question because I'll essentially agree with your concern in the sense that, in our system, our president is head of state and head of government. In many countries, that position is actually divided into two. And in essence, the American president is also the head of global government. I mean, it's an impossible job under the best of circumstances. And I think one of the great tensions in the early Obama administration, and we can't get ahead of ourselves here, but we can't imagine the alternative, I think, right now, is
opportunity and not threat.
Opportunity, not threat, right? Is that the American people want their president to be more concerned about their communities than Baghdad or Kabul. I mean, that there's a real powerful sense that Americans want their president to come home, right? And that their politics to be concerned about the infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt, the schools that need to be made better, the jobs that need to be created, the healthcare system that needs to get fixed. So Obama's going to have extraordinary domestic pressure to stay here and to be present and to solve the domestic challenges. Because what's driving the 81% disapproval, I think, isn't the war. It's really the struggle that every day people are going through in their own lives, in the sense that Washington isn't providing an adequate response to the struggle that they feel. So Senator Obama is going to need to produce back here, while also having extraordinary global demands on his time, on his attention. And I think what it means is that the team that he appoints, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the ambassadors to the top 15 to 20 countries, China, India, Brazil, so on, these are going to be monumentally and very consequential appointments, and that many of these people may have more power and influence in these roles than we've seen in a very long time, maybe since Rumsfeld, or that was a joke, and a lot of running room, because he's going to have to manage the management of this next presidency is just going to be unbelievable. And I think one of the things that I think is part of our job is to challenge, but also to understand how hard it's going to be the next president of the United States. And that we need to be as much cheerleader as we are critic, I think, as we go into next year, because it's going to be hard. People in Washington have got used to doing nothing for 12 years. Very little got done in the Bush era. Tax cuts in the war, that was about it. And I can tell you, as being a Washington person, the culture of the city has gotten used to doing nothing. And, it's gotten used to, I coach Little League soccer and help manage a travel soccer team, right? I mean, I was able to do that in part because there wasn't really all that much going on in Washington the last few years. But when you extend that across the whole culture, Senator Obama is going to have to push what is a culture that's gotten used to lethargy and lack of activity, despite Nancy Pelosi's leadership and Harry Reid's leadership. And that's going to be hard. So I think this is going to be, my counsel as somebody who's now been amazingly in Washington for 16 years, I can't really believe it, is that, the Bush broke the city. And it's going to be hard for that city to go from broken to a humming machine, passing all sorts of legislation and implementing all the stuff that we all want to see. And I think it's one of the reasons, if any of you saw the amazing panel today that Steve Hildebrand did, was anybody in that room? If you didn't come to that panel, try to watch it on C-SPAN or on the web, I guess, whatever. It was one of the most inspirational things I've ever seen in my years in politics, listening to the Obama staff talk about how they knew from day one of this campaign that they were building a grassroots army to actually pass legislation and change the country and not just to win the election. That from the first meeting with Barack and his staff in 2006, this was discussed. What an amazing thing, right? And he knew that this was not going to be over on November 3rd or whatever the hell it is. It's just the beginning. And our greatest battles are going to be in the next 4 to 5 years, not between now and November. Let's take two more. I'm sorry the answer's been so long. We've gone, yes, ma'am. We've had some boys. We need some girls. Yep.
I'll be somewhat more specific. I think, number one, I think we need a successor regime to Kyoto, one with real teeth, and then one that's going to make real progress in a much faster timetable than is currently being discussed. Two, I think we need a real commitment in real dollars of democratization. Not democracy at a point of a gun, as we've seen, but really building civil society in places around the world, whether it's China and all these other places, that is going to be building the building blocks of a democracy that is able to rise from the bottom up. And I think the third thing we need to do is really fundamentally redefine the so-called war on terror and redefine it in a way that is actually about the kind of daily struggles that people are facing on a daily basis, the ones that are leading to the despair and hopelessness in large swaths of the world that then have people turn to an ideology that offers supposedly simple answers like the ones being peddled by Al-Qaeda and other places, and really respond to some of those kinds of concerns, the kinds of things that the original Alliance for Progress back in the 1960s was all about.
I would say the three major things are, first of all, nuclear non-proliferation. There has to be a serious revival of nuclear non-proliferation for the simple reason that nuclear arms are a real potential problem in some states or failed states or whatever. And by simply punting on that, the Bush administration created most of the problems it's been dealing with in that area. Secondly, climate change. The U.S. should pass some sort of legislation to put a price on carbon here, and then go into the Copenhagen process with a firm position to negotiate from. And thirdly, I think that the U.S. just has to make a commitment to re-engagement. It doesn't have to be that specific, but just sort of more of a positive profile will actually go a long way to enable the existing international relations to come back to life.
And those are both pretty good, I thought. Three, I'm agreeing with both of them, but just three emphasis points. One is, and it's amazing neither of them mention Iraq, right? Isn't that interesting? Is that he's going to have to manage whatever happens in Iraq well, or it could be destructive to his presidency. I mean, this is so much on people's minds. There's no guarantee this is going to go well and be easy. It's still going to, my great fear is that it's going to consume his presidency for the next 2 to 3 years as much as it has Bush's, which would be a tragedy for us, because it's time to put what's happening there in its proper context globally, I think. Second is, I think what Andrei said about democratization, and we almost have to come up with a new terminology around this, this is very important, I think, and it's something that I don't think we even have the right language for or the right way to think about this, but this notion of helping fragile states and emerging democracies strengthen their civil society in a way that's more sophisticated, smarter than the tools that we have now. We don't have adequate tools. Many of the things that we built to manage the world today really didn't anticipate that level of sort of support and help. And I think it's something that is going to require, I think, a lot of rethinking. And I would put underneath that global poverty reduction and a lot of the work, the One campaign, there's a lot of One people here is working on. I think that fits under number two. And then I guess I would, the climate change. I mean, I think what Michael said is very important, is that, we just held 2 forums in the last 10 days. One was Senator Bingaman laid out his vision for how cap and trade would go forward, putting a price on carbon and actually enacting it next year prior to Copenhagen becomes really critical for our credibility in this entire global climate change debate, to see if America is really serious about it. And we've explored on our website, you can take a look, but we've looked very heavily at cap and trade. But we are enthusiastic about carbon tax, and I know that this is something we could all have a whole other session about and talk about. But Rob Shapiro, who is the head of our globalization initiative, has just come out with a very far-reaching and big idea to do a carbon tax trade-off, a shift, where we'd reduce the payroll tax in half and replace a bad tax with a good tax, in essence. A bad tax being the payroll tax being very regressive, not good for working people, not good for small business, and replace it with a good tax, which is a price on carbon, which would be a politically palatable way to frankly get a carbon tax through, because it would be revenue neutral and wouldn't be in that sense a tax increase, right? It would have some other, he's calling it a tax shift. And those are the kind of creative thinking I think we have to do what Michael said, which is to, if we're going to be serious at Copenhagen next year, to restart the Kyoto process, we've got a lot of work to do here. I was pleased to hear Speaker Pelosi today and the way she talked about this. But I also think the way she addressed it, if you listen to her 4 things she wanted to work on, she said energy security. And I think energy security is exactly the wrong way to be actually thinking about climate change and the opportunity that we have. Because again, it's defensive as opposed to offensive and being confident that we can do this. It's reactive as opposed to proactive. And I think we still have a lot of work to do on the language around all this stuff. Let me take, but that was a great question. Tracy, last one, or we have to, are you sure? I think we started 10 minutes late. Okay, we're going to go one more. Tracy, thank you, Tracy. Okay, back there all the way.
Well, I think we're in good shape if Obama becomes president in terms of language, because he obviously has a gift for for rhetoric and for coming up with the right words to describe things. I do think that nuclear non-proliferation has to be a real part of the solution, long-term solution to countries like Iran getting nuclear weapons. The essence of nuclear non-proliferation was that there would be a security umbrella that was provided by the countries that had, and that the other countries would therefore forswear that. And it was done in an organized process. The entire process has basically atrophied, and it should be revived, because this is a problem that will only accelerate going forward, because like all technologies, nuclear is naturally becoming easier for people to do with the internet and so on and so forth. So this is a very important issue, and I would make reestablishing a real nuclear non-proliferation effort a key part of dealing with Iran as well as other potential Irans down the road.
And one last thing, let me jump in, is that I think the Iran thing, just relating to Iraq, I've written about this a lot on my blog, is that the whole Bush orientation towards Iran has been so fascinating to me, because Iran's rise is a direct result of our policy in Iraq. And when I've talked to friends of mine who are much more knowledgeable about security matters than I am, I've always said to them, if you war gamed out the invasion of Iraq, and that we were imagining putting in 2 political parties in Iraq, who both of which, by the way, during the Iran-Iraq war went to and lived in Iran, right? So in a time when their country was at war with another nation, they actually left their own country and lived in the opposing country they were at war with, right? And that they're the governing powers that went in, that these are obviously the first Shiite-led Arab government in the history of the Middle East, that the inability for the administration to understand that the obvious outcome of a Shiite-led government in Iraq was to dramatically increase Iran's power in the Middle East, then causing all sorts of other secondary sets of problems, was as big a blunder or oversight as any other element of what the tragedy of Iraq has been. And of course their reaction to it was to get angry at, and I kept wondering whether they were angry at themselves, for having actually caused this, right? But I mean, the irrationality of the Bush administration's response to the rise of Iran has been, I think, in some ways the most awful part of this entire very disappointing administration. What's interesting, though, is that Nick Burns, who is a respected and thoughtful diplomat, is now engaged in a discussion with the Iranian nuclear negotiator. And we're starting to see what could be a different strategy and a different approach, even coming out of this administration, towards Iran, which is very important, particularly because the saber rattling of recent days has been between the Iranians and the Israelis, not with us, right? And this is a flashpoint in the world. This is a legitimately dangerous and scary threat, I think, to the globe. So what I will say is that we will be talking about Iran a lot, I think, in the next few years. And I think Obama's trip to Iraq it's going to be very important to see how he talks about this as well. But Michael's right that the nuclear non-proliferation regime has atrophied, and we've got a lot of work to do. For follow-up, ndn.org is our site.
Journal.org.
Democracyjournal.org. Great book, right? For everybody. Thanks so much for your time, everybody, very much. Thank you.